politics, but to explore something darker, stranger. While Rome gave us roads, aqueducts, and legal systems, it also gave us some of the most absurd, theatrical, and downright disturbing punishments the ancient world ever saw. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Vestals buried alive, the high price of virginity. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins were the spiritual equivalent of national Wi-Fi. If they went down, everything went wrong. These women were hand-picked before puberty to serve the goddess Vesta, keeper of the eternal flame. Their job? Keep that sacred fire burning, and more importantly, stay away from men. For 30 years. Now, breaking a vow of chastity in ancient Rome wasn't just frowned upon, it was treated like detonating a nuke in the middle of the Senate. If a Vestal was caught fooling around, the punishment was literally being buried alive. Yes, alive. Not metaphorically cancelled. Not sent to the naughty corner. Straight up entombed underground. Why buried and not, say, executed with a sword like a normal ancient crime? Simple. Romans believed you couldn't spill a Vestal's blood. It would offend the gods. So they found a delightful loophole. Dig a pit, lower her in with a flickering oil lamp, a little bread, and a pitcher of water. Because hey, hydration matters. And then seal her in. Voila, no blood, no mess, no divine tantrums. The poor girl would lie there in the dark, thinking about her life choices while Rome dusted off its hands and moved on. You'd think the guys she got caught with would suffer the same fate, but nah. They were usually whipped to death in public. Still brutal, just quicker. To be fair, becoming a Vestal was a big honor. You got front row seats at the games, travelled in fancy carriages, and even had the power to pardon condemned prisoners with a single word. But all of that came with one little catch. Mess up once, and you're sleeping underground, permanently. And yes, Rome took it that seriously. One famous Vestal, Cornelia, was accused during Emperor Domitian's reign. Before being sentenced, she reportedly shouted, "Does Caesar think I've had sex with a god then? Because no mortal man touched me?" Bold move. Didn't work. So if you're ever feeling overwhelmed by your job, just remember, at least your boss isn't threatening to bury you in a hole with some stale bread and a dusty oil lamp. Rome, where HR policies were written in stone, and fear. Poena culle, death in a sack, with animal roommates. Ah, ancient Rome, the birthplace of philosophy, architecture, and punishments that sound like fever dreams. Let's talk about poena culle, which translates to penalty of the sack. And no, this isn't some quirky medieval game show. It's what happened if you committed the ultimate Roman taboo, killing your father. Romans didn't just slap you with a fine or toss you in jail. No. If you murdered dear old dad, they gave you the deluxe punishment package, starring you and 4 unfortunate animals. First, the Romans would tie your hands, maybe give you a moment to reflect on your life choices. Spoiler, you'd made bad ones. Then sew you into a large leather sack. Sounds cozy, right? But it gets better. Joining you in the sack were a dog, for loyalty you lacked, a monkey, because why not add chaos, a snake, to slither through your regrets, and a rooster, perhaps to announce your doom at sunrise. Then the sack, now bursting with bad decisions and animal rage, was hurled into a river, ideally a deep one. The result? A flailing, yelping, screeching, hissing blender of panic and poetic justice. No one really knows why these specific animals were chosen, but historians think it was symbolic. Dogs represented family, monkeys chaos, snakes deceit, and roosters vigilance. Basically, your sins made flesh and feathers. Can you imagine the moment inside that sack? You're being headbutted by a monkey while a snake coils around your leg, the dog's losing its mind, and the rooster thinks it's a Tuesday. If this sounds like the worst escape room ever, you're not far off. The punishment was rare, thankfully, but Rome revived it occasionally just to make a point, usually under emperors who loved the theatrical. It wasn't just about killing the criminal, it was about making a statement, and maybe traumatizing a few spectators while they were at it. So next time your dad makes a lame joke or forgets your birthday, just be glad you weren't born in Rome. Back then, patricide didn't mean therapy. It meant sack time with the serpent circus. Crucifixion. But upside down, flipping the script on suffering. When we hear the word crucifixion, most of us think of one thing: a wooden cross, a slow, agonizing death, and a warning to anyone watching not to mess with the state. It was Rome's signature punishment, brutal, public, and humbling. But leave it to the Romans to occasionally throw in a little creative flair. Enter the inverted crucifixion. Yes, upside down. Because apparently, dying upright wasn't humiliating enough. This method was reserved for special cases, usually people the authorities really wanted to make an example of. Criminals, traitors, and occasionally rebels who insisted on being difficult even in death. But perhaps the most famous upside-down crucifixion was that of St. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. According to tradition, when Peter was sentenced to die by crucifixion under Emperor Nero, he made a strange request. "Crucify me upside down. I'm not worthy to die like my Lord." And Rome, being the efficiency machine that it was, said, "Sure, why not?" Now here's where things get a little intense. Crucifixion was already one of the worst ways to die, combining asphyxiation, blood loss, and total public humiliation. But flipping the body changed the dynamic. Blood rushed to the head, muscles strained in unnatural ways, breathing became nearly impossible, and it hurt. A lot. Think of it like this. It's the difference between sitting through a boring lecture and sitting through that lecture upside down while someone drives nails into your ankles. Not quite the same vibe. But this wasn't just about suffering. It was about symbolism. An inverted cross became, ironically, a symbol of humility. Peter's choice was meant to show reverence, not rebellion. Unfortunately, that image later got co-opted by horror movies and metal bands, giving it a very different PR spin. The Romans, they didn't care about the symbolism. For them, it was about sending a message. Cross us, and we'll make your death as weird and memorable as possible. So the next time you're hanging out, hopefully not literally, remember that ancient Rome could turn any punishment into performance art. Upside-down crucifixion wasn't just death. It was death with dramatic direction. Decimation, the original team-building exercise with a twist of trauma. When you think of a motivational speech, you might picture a coach yelling, "We win together, we lose together," but in ancient Rome the phrase could easily have been, "We march together," or "1 in 10 of you dies." Welcome to the charming world of decimation, a military punishment so brutal it makes modern boot camp look like a spa day. Here's how it worked. If a Roman unit showed cowardice in battle, tried to desert or mutinied, the commander had a nuclear option. Not in the explosive sense, more like the psychological warfare sense. The entire group would be lined up, and every 10 soldiers would draw lots. The lucky one? He got beaten to death by his 9 comrades, with clubs, stones, or whatever was nearby. Yes, you heard that right. Not only did you face death, you also had to kill your buddy, the guy you probably just shared wine and bread with the night before, all to prove loyalty to Rome. It was like Survivor, Roman Legion edition, except nobody won immunity and everyone left traumatized. And don't assume they got a break afterward. The 9 survivors didn't get high fives and a long weekend. Nope. They were given barley instead of wheat for rations, a Roman way of saying, "We're disappointed in you," and forced to camp outside the fort's safety. The logic behind decimation was cold but effective. If you feared your own comrades more than the enemy, you'd think twice about running away. And oddly, it worked. Roman discipline was legendary, and decimation kept soldiers marching in line, even if they had to step over a few bodies to do it. One of the most infamous uses of decimation was by Crassus, the wealthy general who formed a triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. After a humiliating defeat in the Spartacus slave revolt, he decimated a disgraced unit. Because nothing says, "we're back on track," like a casual in-house massacre. So next time your boss says, "we need to boost team accountability," just be glad you're not living under Crassus. In Rome, failure wasn't just punished, it was distributed. The fork of heretics, a medieval neck workout. Nobody asked for. Let's say you lived in ancient Rome, or more accurately, the later Roman Empire, during those twilight centuries when things got weirder, darker, and way more obsessed with heresy. You spoke out against the church or challenged some sacred belief. Rome didn't just scold you. It gifted you an accessory you'd never forget, the fork of heretics. Picture this, a metal rod with two prongs at each end. One end pointed up under your chin, the other jammed right into your upper chest. A miniature trident sandwiching your neck. Sounds uncomfortable? Oh, we're just getting started. Once this lovely device was strapped on, you were forbidden to move your head. At all. Look down. Stabbed. Nod off. Stabbed. Try to whisper a heretical thought to the guy next to you. Stabbed by your own collar. It didn't draw blood, at least not at first. That was the genius. The fork wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to exhaust you. Mentally, physically, spiritually. You'd be left standing sometimes for days, straining every muscle just to avoid impaling yourself. It was like playing a game of don't move, where the prize was not slowly skewering your own throat. And while we call it the fork of heretics, it was also used on blasphemers, witches, suspected liars, and anyone who annoyed a bishop before breakfast. It was versatile torture, custom fit for silence, stillness, and soul-shattering discomfort. To make things even more theatrical, the fork sometimes had little Latin inscriptions engraved on it. Things like, "I renounce my sin," or "I am guilty," because nothing boosts your confession like being slowly impaled by typography. What's wild is that this punishment wasn't even one of Rome's most extreme. It was more of a starter pack for sinners. No blood, no public execution, just quiet suffering and internal panic. A sort of intro course in agony, Heresy 101. So if you've ever tried to hold in a sneeze during a serious meeting, imagine doing that for 3 days straight, with iron poking at your throat. In Rome, silence wasn't golden. It was enforced, with 2 rusty prongs and a neck cramp from the gods. Thrown from the Tarpeian rock, Rome's original unfriend button. Forget passive-aggressive texts, or dramatic social media unfollows. In ancient Rome, if you betrayed the state, they didn't just cut you off. They threw you off a cliff. Welcome to the Tarpeian Rock. A jagged 80-foot drop on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, just a short stroll from the Roman Forum. It wasn't just a scenic viewpoint. It was where the Republic took out the trash, by launching traitors straight off it. And yes, it was just as theatrical as it sounds. Now, the rock got its name from Tarpeia, a Roman girl who betrayed the city to enemy Sabines in exchange for what she thought would be shiny gold bracelets. The Sabines, ever the literal thinkers, crushed her with their shields instead, technically fulfilling the deal. Her body was tossed from the cliff, and the rock was named in her honor. Moral of the story? Don't trust invaders or vague payment plans. But after that, the Tarpeian Rock became Rome's favorite tool for dealing with traitors, corrupt officials, false witnesses, and anyone who made the state go, yeah, this one needs dramatic punishment. No hanging, no sword, just a short flight and a sudden stop. The condemned were often stripped, paraded, and then marched to the edge, where gravity handled the sentencing. And yes, there was usually a crowd. Nothing like a good old-fashioned execution to spice up market day. It was public, It was final, and it was symbolic. You weren't just dying, you were being removed from the city, physically and spiritually. The ultimate cancel culture, Rome edition. Interestingly, the rock sat just a stone's throw away from the Temple of Jupiter, which meant that if you lied to the gods or the state, your final moments included a front-row view of heaven. Briefly. Over time, more elaborate punishments came along. Lions, crucifixions, burning tunics. But the Tarpeian rock remained a classic, elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its message. So next time someone says, they really threw him under the bus, remind them, the Romans did it first. No wheels, just stone, and betrayal echoing through the hills. Damnatio ad bestias, death by lion, applause, optional. Welcome to the Colosseum. Stone, sweat, and 50,000 roaring fans. Ancient Rome's version of cable TV. Today's main event? Damnatio ad bestias, or as we'd call it, being fed to wild animals while everyone eats snacks. This punishment, meaning condemnation to the beasts, was Rome's go-to for criminals, traitors, prisoners of war, and, most tragically, Christians who wouldn't bow to imperial gods. And make no mistake, this wasn't just about death. It was about spectacle. Rome didn't believe in boring executions. They believed in theatre. The condemned were tossed into an arena where hungry lions, leopards, bears, or sometimes even elephants were waiting. But here's the twist. Rome being Rome, they often dressed the victims up first. That's right, they turned their deaths into morality plays. One unlucky soul might be dressed as Orpheus, only to be mauled mid-lyre solo. Another might play a mythological villain like Prometheus, only for birds to peck at him in accurate reenactment. It was entertainment, justice, and religious propaganda, all rolled into one fur-covered disaster. You might ask, did they even have a chance to defend themselves? Absolutely not. This wasn't a trial. This was a death sentence wrapped in applause. The crowd came to see blood. And if the lions were sleepy that day? No problem. Romans had tricks, like poking them with hot irons or starving them for a couple of days beforehand. Showtime must go on. And remember, this wasn't limited to hardened criminals. You could end up in the arena for theft, political dissent, or even being on the wrong side of religious law. The only thing standing between you and lion lunch? Favour from a very generous emperor. But don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't just sadism. It was calculated. A warning to anyone watching. Step out of line, and this could be you. Rome ruled by fear and felines. In time, the Christian martyrs flipped the script, turning beastly death into a badge of honour. But for most, damnatio ad bestias was less about glory and more about gore. So the next time you grumble about jury duty, be glad it doesn't involve dressing as a myth and dodging leopards. Forced suicide with honour, when Rome let you die with dignity. Kinda in ancient Rome, getting a death sentence didn't always mean you were dragged to the arena or tossed off a cliff. Sometimes, if you were lucky, or rather, politically connected, you got a special kind of punishment. Forced suicide. Sounds contradictory, right? We're not going to kill you, but we strongly suggest you do it yourself. Here's how it worked. If you were a senator, a noble, or just someone high enough in Roman society to own more than one tunic, and you managed to offend the emperor, maybe by plotting a coup, maybe just by existing too confidently, you'd receive a quiet visit. A scroll would be delivered, a polite message from the emperor, and it would go something like this. You have dishonored the state. Please, take the honorable route out. Translation: kill yourself by sunset, or we'll do it for you, and make it nasty. The upside? If you complied, your family got to keep your property. Your name might even be left unblemished in the records. Maybe. It was the Roman version of a severance package, with blood instead of paperwork. This wasn't considered a humiliation. It was viewed as noble. In fact, many elites saw it as a final act of control. A chance to write their own ending, sometimes literally. Think warm bath, a blade to the wrist, and a final monologue. very on-brand for Rome's love of drama. The philosopher Seneca the Younger famously faced this fate. Accused of being part of a conspiracy against Nero, possibly falsely, he was told to end things himself. He slit his wrists, then his ankles, but the bleeding would always kill you. Sometimes, they just let you do it beautifully. The wooden donkey, when sitting became a crime. If you've ever complained about an uncomfortable chair, ancient Rome would like a word, because one of their more imaginative punishments involved a piece of furniture, the now infamous wooden donkey, or as it should have been called, the pain pony of doom. This device wasn't an actual donkey, of course. It was a tall, narrow, sharply angled wooden beam, shaped like an A-frame with a razor-thin peak. The condemned, usually thieves, slaves, or rebellious soldiers, were forced to straddle it. That's right. Their entire body weight pressed down on that sharp edge, right between the legs. But wait, it gets worse. To really drive the point home, pun intended, weights were often tied to the person's ankles. Gravity did the rest. The longer you sat, the more the beam tore into your flesh. Slowly, painfully, and depending on how generous the executioner was feeling, you might be left there for hours. Now, the Romans didn't invent the wooden donkey. It likely came from earlier Middle Eastern torture traditions. But oh, did they embrace it with flair. Because if there was one thing Rome loved, it was punishment with pageantry. This wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it was just used as a very persuasive form of public humiliation. Picture it. A crowded square. A merchant caught cheating customers, now wailing atop the donkey while kids laughed and vendors sold snacks. It was pain, performance, and a life lesson all in one. Even worse, Roman generals sometimes used it as field discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed could find themselves straddling the donkey as a reminder to follow orders, because nothing says morale booster like internal bleeding. And yes, there were occasional modifications. Some donkeys were metal, some had spikes. One record even mentions a heated version, because apparently Rome was taking feedback and innovating on the fly. It was humiliating, it was brutal, and it turned the simple act of sitting into a punishment that could scar you for life, physically and mentally. So the next time your office chair feels a bit stiff, just remember, at least it's not a sharp triangle and no one's tying rocks to your feet. In ancient Rome, bad posture wasn't your biggest problem. The furniture was. Branding the face, when your mugshot was permanent. In a world without ID cards, background checks, or Google searches, ancient Rome had a simple solution for keeping track of criminals. Just burn it onto their face. Yes, we're talking about branding. Not the kind companies do with logos, but the kind where your actual forehead becomes a crime label. And if you were a thief, runaway slave, or repeat offender, congratulations, you now had a permanent facial feature that screamed, "Do not trust this guy." The branding was usually done with a heated metal rod, pressed into the skin with the gentle mercy of a blacksmith on a deadline. Letters like F for fur, thief, or C for calumnia, false accuser, were scorched onto your forehead or cheek. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a one-star Yelp review, but on your skull. And this wasn't done in some private back room. Oh no. Branding was public, a spectacle, a lesson. The idea was, humiliate the criminal, and others will think twice. It wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda, sizzling straight into flesh. Now imagine living with that mark. Walking through the market, everyone knows. Trying to get a job? Good luck. Flirting with someone? Forget it. You weren't a person anymore. You were a walking crime scene. Runaway slaves were especially targeted. Many were branded with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, meaning escapee. And if they ran again after that, harsher branding, or worse. Slaves weren't just property. They were expected to wear their disobedience like a badge. Some clever folks tried to remove or disguise the marks, through cuts, tattoos, or even makeup. But Rome, ever prepared, made those acts punishable too. Tampering with your brand was like trying to Photoshop your criminal record. Didn't fly. Later, emperors like Constantine tried to tone it down, suggesting brands be placed on the hands or legs instead of the face. But even then, the point was the same: permanent shame. So the next time someone says, "Face your consequences," just be glad they don't mean that literally. Because in ancient Rome, they didn't just remember your crime. They made sure your face did too. Tongue removal for blasphemy. Say goodbye to small talk. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech was conditional. You could praise the emperor, debate philosophy, and recite poetry. Just don't blaspheme. Because if you badmouthed the gods, insulted the emperor, or whispered the wrong words in the wrong ears, you might find yourself on the receiving end of a punishment that's both literal and horrifying. Tongue removal. Yes, they really did it. The logic was simple. If your words were dangerous, Rome would silence you, permanently. The process wasn't exactly subtle. There was no anesthesia, no sterile tools, just forceps, iron, and pain. A soldier or executioner would clamp your tongue, slice it off, or in some cases, rip it out entirely. It wasn't surgery. It was state-approved censorship. And it wasn't always about religion. Sure, blaspheming against the gods was a fast track to punishment, especially if you mocked Jupiter in public or questioned the sacred fires. But often, blasphemy meant speaking out against the emperor or the empire's moral order. Basically, if your mouth made powerful people uncomfortable, you were suddenly a medical emergency. One wrong joke, one heretical whisper, one rebellious chant, snip. This punishment wasn't just brutal, it was theatrical. Public tongue removals sent a clear message. Words have power, but ours has more. And even if you survived the ordeal, life afterward wasn't exactly a picnic. You couldn't speak clearly. You couldn't argue your innocence. You couldn't even scream properly. It was isolation through mutilation. A scarlet letter carved not into your skin, but into your silence. Ironically, some of the earliest Christian martyrs suffered this fate. They refused to renounce their faith and kept preaching. Rome couldn't silence their ideas, so it went for the messenger, literally. Of course, the Christians then turned these stories into tales of divine courage, which only made the Romans more furious. If you're thinking this sounds extreme, remember, Rome was obsessed with control, and there's no better way to control a person than by cutting out their voice. So next time someone tells you to hold your tongue, be thankful it's just a figure of speech, because in ancient Rome, they meant it. Breaking on the wheel, when your bones became art. If you thought the Romans were running out of creative ways to destroy a person, allow us to introduce the wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, or for those with a dramatic flair, the Catherine wheel, named later in medieval times. It was less an execution and more a macabre sculpture session using the human body as raw material. Here's how it worked. First, the condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread, like a grisly human starfish. Then, an executioner armed with a heavy iron bar would begin the real work, smashing the limbs, one by one, slowly, deliberately. The goal wasn't to kill right away. Oh no. The goal was to shatter the bones while keeping the victim alive, snap the arms, crush the thighs, twist the ankles so they no longer looked like ankles. The body would fold unnaturally, becoming a grotesque display of pain and precision. But the pièce de résistance. The broken body was then woven through the wheel's spokes, limbs bent and threaded like a nightmarish macrame project. Sometimes the wheel was hoisted up on a pole, like a flag of warning. Other times, it was left to spin gently in the wind, because why not add ambiance? This wasn't just about punishment. It was public messaging. Breaking on the wheel was used for crimes considered especially vile, like murder, treason, or highway robbery. It said to the crowd, "This is what happens when you step too far out of line. And you didn't just die. You decayed in full view. Survivors? Rare. But here's the twisted twist. If someone did survive the ordeal, say they were still breathing after a day or two, they were sometimes shown mercy with a final blow to the chest or neck. Sometimes. As horrifying as this sounds, the punishment outlived Rome. Medieval Europe loved it so much they turned it into an art form, adding spikes, fires, and dramatic scripts. Rome had simply set the stage. So next time you think your commute is rough, remember, at least you're not strapped to a wooden wheel, becoming the centerpiece of a public bone gallery. In Rome, justice wasn't blind. It was bold, brutal, and built for maximum exposure. Execution by hot ash, death by the grainy slow burn. When it came to killing creatively, ancient Rome always had something simmering. Literally, enter one of its lesser-known but deeply disturbing punishments, execution by hot ash. It's not as famous as crucifixion or the lions, but it might just be one of the slowest and most psychologically terrifying ways to die ever devised. No swords, no bloodshed, no quick release, just ashes. Heated, suffocating, and endless. This gruesome method is credited, unsurprisingly, to Emperor Nero, a man who treated executions like performance art. In one recorded instance, Nero had an enemy buried up to the neck in a pit. So far, classic Rome. But instead of beheading or stoning him, Nero added a twist. A funnel was inserted into the man's mouth, and hot ash was slowly poured in. Not boiling water, not fire, ash. At first glance it seems harmless. Ashes are soft, right? But here's where the genius horror kicks in. The ash is scorching. It clogs the throat, sears the lungs, and suffocates from within. It doesn't kill fast. It chokes. Slowly, gradually. You feel every moment, every breath turning to fire, every swallow becoming your last. And as the ash settles, you're not bleeding. You're not burned on the outside. But inside, everything is failing. It's death by dust. Death by suffocation dressed as silence. Why ash, though? Because it was humiliating, undignified. Ashes were the remnants of destruction, used to clean filth, wipe away traces of things burned. To die in ash was symbolic. It meant you were beneath notice, unworthy of steel or flame. You weren't even worth a dramatic death, just the slow grind of what was left over. It's worth noting this punishment wasn't common. It was reserved for those Nero really didn't like. People whose very existence he wanted erased quietly, yet with maximum psychological torment. And to the crowd, it didn't look like much. No blood, no screams. Just a man in a hole, and a trickle of grey dust. So the next time someone tells you, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember that in Nero's Rome, that wasn't just poetic. It was protocol. The tunica molesta, Rome's deadliest wardrobe malfunction. In ancient Rome, fashion didn't kill, unless you were wearing the tunica molesta, or as we might call it, the flammable death robe. Picture this. You're led into an arena or strapped to a stake, and instead of chains or ropes, the executioner approaches you with a tunic. Oh good, you think. At least they're giving me something to wear. Then you notice it's dripping, not with water, but with pitch, tar, and oil. This is the tunica molesta, literally annoying tunic, but more accurately, highly flammable nightmare onesie. It was a garment soaked in combustible material, fitted snugly, and then set on fire while you were still very much alive and inside it. This wasn't just a method of execution, it was a public performance. Most famously used under emperors like Nero, who turned executions into after-dinner entertainment. During his infamous garden parties, Nero would use the tunica molesta to light the grounds, human torches illuminating his twisted vision of Roman leisure. Who wore it? Arsonists, traitors, Christians, anyone deemed worthy of a particularly theatrical end. The flames clung to the body, melting skin, igniting hair and searing lungs. And there was no escape, no rolling to put it out. The tunic stuck to you. It burned with you. And because Rome loved a good mythological reference, they sometimes modelled it after Hercules' poison shirt, a garment that caused the hero unbearable agony before his death. Rome didn't just kill you, they made it poetic. The real genius, if we can call it that, was in the psychology. You weren't just dying. You were displayed. Shrieking, flailing, engulfed in fire while crowds watched. It sent a message clearer than any stone inscription. This is what happens when you cross the empire. Some records even suggest music was played during the burning. Nero reportedly plucked his lyre as the flames rose. Talk about a hot performance. So if you ever complain that your clothes are uncomfortable or too tight, be glad they're not soaked in oil and part of a public execution ceremony. Because in Rome, fashion didn't just make a statement, it screamed, damnatio memoriae. When Rome deleted you from history, most Roman punishments ended with the body, but some, they reached further. Into memory, into legacy, into obliteration. This is damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, Rome's most haunting punishment of all, because what's worse than death? Being forgotten on purpose. If you were an emperor who embarrassed the state, a general who rebelled, or a senator who fell too far from grace, Rome might not just kill you, they would erase you. Completely. Statues, smashed or defaced, inscriptions, chiseled out, portraits, painted over. Your name? Struck from official documents, coins and monuments. If you had achievements, they were reassigned. If you had supporters, they were silenced. And the most devastating part? It worked. Many of the people subjected to damnatio memoriae were powerful, known, feared. Yet today, we don't even remember their names, because Rome was that good at deletion. Whole reigns vanish into silence. It's historical vaporization. One of the most famous examples was Emperor Geta, brother of Caracalla. After Caracalla had him assassinated, in their own mother's arms no less, he didn't stop there. He ordered Geta's image removed from every mosaic, painting and bust. Thousands of inscriptions were edited, his name scratched out by hand. In some surviving art, you can still see the ghost of Geta's figure. Awkward gaps, half faces, names partially scraped away. It's chilling, like history caught in the act of forgetting. But damnatio memoriae wasn't just about vengeance. It was about control. If Rome could rewrite the past, it could sculpt the future. If you could make it seem like someone never existed, then maybe their ideas didn't exist either. It was the empire's way of saying, you were never here, and if anyone says otherwise, they'll be next. There's something terrifyingly modern about it too. We talk today about cancel culture, social erasure, reputations destroyed in hours. But Rome was doing it 2,000 years ago, just with chisels instead of tweets. So as we close this strange journey through Rome's most bizarre punishments, remember this: the cruelest punishment wasn't fire, or lions, or ropes. It was the silence that followed. Because in ancient Rome, the worst thing that could happen to you was to be forgotten. In the early 1800s, the American landscape stretched endlessly westward, wild, unknown, and whispering promises to those bold enough to chase them. The East, crowded with cities, factories, and fading farmland, had begun to feel tight, constrictive. But the West, that was the dream. A blank canvas with just enough danger to make the paint stick. It began as a whisper, in taverns, in church pews, around dinner tables. Stories of open land, of rivers that shimmered like silver, of valleys that bloomed without effort. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had more than doubled the size of the young United States. Suddenly, there was space, unimaginable space, and it belonged to no one, or so the government claimed. For many, the West was more than a direction on a compass. It was a fresh start, a place where your name didn't carry your debts, where nobody asked where you were from, only what you could do with your hands. It called to dreamers and desperados alike, farmers looking for new soil, widows seeking peace, and adventurers chasing legends carved out of campfire tales. There were no highways, no guarantees, and no second chances. Every journey westward began with uncertainty. Would the wagon survive the mountains? Would the river freeze too soon? Would there be food on the other side? And yet, tens of thousands went. Entire families, with infants swaddled in flour sacks and grandmothers tucked between crates of salted pork, set off into the unknown. To go west was to gamble everything, but to stay behind felt like surrendering to a life of limits. The frontier wasn't just a place on a map. It was a test of will, of grit, of the ability to carve order out of chaos using nothing but timber, steel, and raw hope. And as the sun sank behind endless prairies and mountain ridges, casting long shadows on wagon wheels and weary faces, one thing was clear. America's story wasn't written yet. It was being dragged slowly westward, one rickety mile at a time. Before the pioneers could brave the wild frontier, they had to build a vessel that would carry not just supplies, but their entire future. Enter the covered wagon, the backbone of the westward migration. It was no stagecoach or fancy carriage. It was a wooden box on wheels, held together by sweat, hope, and iron nails. Most families didn't build wagons from scratch. They bought them or modified existing carts. The most famous type was the Conestoga, but on the frontier, something smaller, lighter, and cheaper was needed. That became the prairie schooner, so named because its canvas top, billowing in the wind, looked like a ship sailing across